the common understanding at the time was that people tended to go to Europe to get higher degrees because American institutions were not open to women for higher education prior to 1862. And then lastly, we have evolving gender roles. Now, of course, we're talking levels of disparity here, levels of inequality, but this project really only examines gender inequality. So for the 19th century, there's certainly other levels of inequality present, but this project really only discusses what traditional gender roles were for the 19th century and then what they evolved and continued to be. And the big question with this project is, they were striving toward equality, but did they actually achieve it? That's the big question. Okay, so I'll start off and give some background on Mary's early life. She was born in rural Illinois. The family was from rural Illinois. And Dr. Winston, her father, was a medical doctor. He was an immigrant from England. And at this point in time, we're talking post-Civil War, so the late 1860s. And she was the first daughter out of 7 children. And Dr. Winston and his wife had this viewpoint that they wanted their children to have a better education, a better upbringing than they themselves had had. So Carolyn had experience teaching in her younger years. She had taught at a women's seminary in Pennsylvania, and then that translated because she basically homeschooled all of her children. The Winston children did spend time in the public education system in Illinois. However, that was quite short-lived. The Winston family, they were very prolific letter writers. I should mention that now, as that's a lot of where my source material comes from. But they wrote letters back and forth to each other because the family ended up being very spread out across the country. And in one of these letters, Mary writes about the public school system and says that they were studying arithmetic and flourishing miserably. So that gives you some insight into what the public education system was like at the time. And they just felt that they were better off teaching the children at home. So eventually, Carolyn continues the children's education at the Winston family's home, and it garnered this reputation in town. The rural population there began to call it the academy, and the Winston family had this reputation that all of their children were going to go on to gain at least two college degrees, each of them. And for what we know of the 19th century educational system, that's absolutely insane for a reputation. So people in town began to send their children to study in Carolyn's schoolroom and began to take college prep classes, teaching exams, and things like that to continue their own education as well. So the family was generating some income that way. Later on in 1886, the family established the Winston Literary Society. And this is where Carolyn would assign different books for the students to read, and they would write reports on these books and then perform them for parents and other people in the community. And this all led up to Mary's education at the University of Wisconsin. She ended her undergraduate years here in 1889 with a classical degree. So following Mary's education at the University of Wisconsin, she is continuing on in a master's program at the University of Chicago. And in 1892, the university was in its inaugural year. And in the math department, Mary was one of 5 fellows and the only female. So here's where that kind of inequality piece comes in. And we're beginning to see that she's going to occupy these predominantly male spheres, both professionally and throughout her education. So she begins here in the math department and had received recommendations from her professors to attend school in Germany. Because like I mentioned before, there's not much of a chance for women in higher education unless they go to Europe. So she kind of has this stroke of luck. She applied to the University of Göttingen in Germany. And in 1893, Felix Klein, who you can see here, was attending the World's Columbian Exposition, which was held in Chicago that year. She had plans to meet with him and discuss her application to the university. And upon meeting him, he basically could not confirm or deny the fact whether or not her application had been accepted. So at this point, it was really about, am I financially stable enough to do this? Do I have the resources? Because she's coming from rural Illinois. Her family really was unable to support her financially. And this is where Christine Ladd Franklin comes in. Christine Ladd Franklin was one of the women at the time who was kind of championing for women's equality in education. And also, as a side note, with women's suffrage as well. So she hears about Mary's application to the university and about all this financial strife that Mary had encountered. And she gives her $500 for her first year in Germany to go and study. And this was before her application was accepted. I'll just put that into context. We're going on a 50-50. It's either yes or no. And we did the calculation for inflation the other day. $500 in 1893 is about $17,300 today. So for that time period, that was a lot of money. So Mary decides she's going to take this gamble, and she goes to Germany. She takes a steamship and goes before her application has been accepted. And she ends up being accepted. So it worked out. This photograph here is of Klein's 5 students in 1893. Again, you'll see the male to female ratio. So we're still dealing with levels of inequality here, but Mary did feel that her achievements and her worth were recognized while she was in Germany. She thoroughly enjoyed her time there. However, Mary was not the only female student in this program that Felix Klein had kind of piloted. At this point in time, there were 2 other female applicants to the university, and these were Grace Chisholm and Margaret Maltby. Grace Chisholm went on to continue in mathematics, and Margaret Maltby in physics. So they were kind of all together, the 3 of them in this. Their applications were submitted around the same time, and they were kind of in a waiting game when they all got to Germany. Eventually, like I said, all of their applications were accepted. Mary's was the first to be accepted by the Ministry of Education. And I'll tell this little story about their first lecture with Klein. Mary writes home to her family, and she talks about her experience with these 2 other women in her first lecture with Felix Klein. And she writes and she says, "We were a little amused at the close of the lecture when he started to say, 'The gentlemen,' and corrected himself and said, 'members.' He looked back at us and smiled." So I think that goes to show that it wasn't just an adjustment for the ladies to be in a male-dominated sphere, it was also an adjustment for the men, to have women kind of infiltrate this space that they had dominated for so long. And Mary also wrote in this letter home about how the logistics were at the university prior to their applications being submitted. She basically writes and says that Klein had told the ladies, since they were not official students, they could not be intermingling with the other students who were men. So Felix Klein gave them instructions to wait in his office during passing periods, so they were not intermingling with the male students, and then they could come in and join the lecture when it began. So again, we're seeing that education in Germany is a bit more progressive for this time period. So it's, again, leaps and bounds above what the American education system was. But the American education system was helped by the Morrill Land-Grant Act, which I'll kind of get into now. So here we're transitioning to this idea of the liberal Midwest and the new land-grant promise. And this is, of course, helped by the Morrill Land-Grant Act. So I'll just give you some context for kind of what Mary is coming into when she returns from Germany. So she graduates from the university in 1897 and is awarded her PhD. And she returns home. She knows she has to find work. And the ultimate goal was to find a university position. This didn't work out quite as she had planned in the beginning because she returned after taking her exams in 1896. And her PhD had not been awarded at that time. She passed her doctoral examination, but her dissertation had not been published at that point. So they could not award her PhD. And Klein had given her instructions, return to America, take it with you and have it printed. And then the university would officiate her degree. And she returns to the States and is looking for work and ends up teaching high school for a time in Missouri. And she goes and tries to publish her dissertation, but the printer here in the US could not manage the symbols from the mathematical portions of her dissertation. So it had to be sent back to Germany for publication. And she was finally awarded her PhD in 1897. And at this point, she's again in the States. And I'm going to talk now about kind of the evolution of our university, just to give you some insight into the environment that she found herself coming into in 1897. So before we were Kansas State University, we were Bluemont Central College. And this was established in 1860 as a coeducational institution. So that's important to note. Kansas State University has been coeducational since its founding. At this time, when Bluemont Central College was founded, Manhattan was home to the population of New England abolitionists. So this is where that liberal Midwestern viewpoint comes in, which is going to then contrast with Eastern views, Eastern conservative views. And at this time, the population of Manhattan is about 600 people. Now, about a couple years after the establishment of Bluemont Central College, the Morrill Land Grant Act is passed in 1862, excuse me. And this basically set aside federal land holdings that were to be utilized to open public universities for the advancement of agriculture and mechanical arts. And here again, the Morrill Land Grant Act is that piece that makes college education more widely available to the middling and lower classes even. So education became more available to anyone that wanted it. And at this point, in 1863, we become Kansas State Agricultural College, which is now Kansas State University. So the environment that Mary comes into around 1897 kind of shifts a bit from this 1860s view. In the 1890s, the Populist Party, or what is sometimes called the People's Party, there was this conflict that emerged between the state government and the university. And this led to a bunch of faculty layoffs. And so it was in this environment that Mary found herself coming into the university. She was one of the new faculty members hired after all of these layoffs took place. So I'll mention here, Dr. Henry Newson is also an important figure to this project. But after returning to the US and after her dissertation is published, Mary is continuing to search for a university position, and she meets Henry Newson. She meets up with him again at a faculty meeting in Chicago, and they had become good friends at that point. They were well acquainted with each other from when Mary had attended the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. And they were becoming good friends, and Henry told Mary that he would help her look for a position at a university. And they exchanged letters back and forth. And in one of these letters, he told Mary about a position at Kansas State Agricultural College. He wrote, "The place is not the best in the world, but it is well worth getting if nothing better is at hand." So he kind of endorses her in her goal here. And this is where, again, that advocacy piece comes in. because he was one of her advocates in her professional career. So he sends a letter to the hiring committee and to the president at Kansas State at the time, and he writes, quote, "It is hard to imagine the credentials of another candidate which would be considered superior to Miss Winston's. The very names of the subjects she has mastered are dizzy enough to make the non-mathematical man or woman dizzy. With Miss Winston in your faculty, your college could boast of a mathematician that ranks with the best anywhere in the country. In higher mathematics, the State University, so the University of Kansas in Lawrence, has been without a rival among the Kansas colleges for a great many years. For my part, I should gladly welcome a little rivalry, and Miss Winston would put us on our mettle," end quote. So this is kind of a big push that she needs in her professional career. And she takes the position of department chair here in the Department of Mathematics in 1897. And at that point, the math department was not very big. It was Dr. Winston as department chair and probably one assistant, and that was it. Here again, you can see this is a picture of the college faculty from 1897. There's only 5 women in this photo. And again, I'll mention male to female ratio, still not very equal. And when Mary joined the faculty, she was the first woman with a doctorate degree. So during her time here, Mary was very well liked, and she was also involved in, she wasn't just teaching math classes, she taught some German classes and was involved in speaking to student organizations. Everyone wanted to know about her time over in Germany because for the Midwestern population, that was not something that they found very achievable at the time. You know, it's probably pretty rare that you meet somebody that had studied abroad. So Mary was a wealth of knowledge in that respect. However, she was not here in her position very long. She and Dr. Newson at KU wrote back and forth to each other, maintained a correspondence, and they began courting, as one does. And he kind of ployed her with marriage proposals multiple times, to which she would turn him down time and time again. But he was very persistent in his proposals. And Mary eventually was confronted with this choice of, do I do what society expects of me and leave my career to get married, or do I continue? I'm in my dream position. So that was the choice that she was making and having to, and that weighed on her mind quite a bit from the number of times that she turned down Henry's proposals. But eventually, Henry was successful, and Mary resigned as department chair here at Kansas State. And this came as a big shock to faculty, to students, to community members. It was very, very unexpected because they had found Mary to be an invaluable presence here on campus and in the Manhattan community even. So this is a quote I pulled from a letter that was written by the college faculty. They met in discussion following Mary's announcement that she was resigning. And I think you can see really from this quote, they write about her clear sense of justice, her logical mind, her earnestness of character, sympathetic nature. They weren't expecting her to leave. They thought she would stay for quite a while. But she ends up marrying Henry Newson, and they take up residence in Lawrence. And this is, again, a shift in her life that we are seeing, where this is the piece to examine gender roles by, because she's left behind her career. And traditionally that would mean, you know, for the 19th century, you become a housewife and you are running a home and raising a family. So the contrast here, and you'll see as I go through these next few slides, is very untraditional, surprisingly. So I tend to take the viewpoint that Mary and Henry were quite progressive for their time. In letters back and forth to each other, Mary kind of expressed her concerns about getting married. She was honest with Henry and said, well, I'm not very accustomed to being a housewife. I don't think I'd be very good at it because all I've done is my career. And he kind of continuously tries to reassure her, and he basically phrases it in a way which he views them to be equals. And he writes in a letter about how he had observed two types of husbands. He claimed he thought one sort treated their wives as dolls, to be petted, amused, and treated like children, while the other sort considered their wives as their equals and intellectual companions and as beings with souls. And he counted himself among this second type who viewed their wives as their intellectual equal. And she writes, they're continuing to write back and forth, and he says, I have chosen for a wife a woman who is my equal in every sense of the word, intellectually, educationally, scholarly, and morally. I know it and intend to recognize the fact every day of my life. And then he later says, I want to arrange the household duties so that you shall have time and the leisure to do your best mentally. I do not want you to give your time to the affairs of the house. I believe, dear, that we are fully in accord on this point, and we must not let the daily cares and duties of life interfere with the larger plan of our lives. So just from that quote alone, Henry's basically denying what is traditional of society at this point in time. And he's saying, you are my equal, and I'm going to help foster and continue your growth in your career in any way that I can. And he does so, recognizing that Mary was struggling to adjust to married life when they returned to Lawrence. And it wasn't just them in the household. Henry's mother and his widowed sister were living with them, and they thought Mary was just the strangest person they had ever met. Because from their view, why would a lady want to sit and study and read all day? Who does that? But eventually, I think they did find a middle ground, and there were ways that Mary did stay involved with campus life in Lawrence and with continuing her career. She found that it was typical for faculty wives to join Faculty Wives Club at KU. However, she kind of dismissed that and was like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to go my own way. But she did join a German club on campus because, for her, those were her people. That was what she was used to. And she continued that. Now, professionally, she also did continue in that vein where Henry would sometimes come home from work and, maybe he'd have a problem he didn't know how to solve. So they worked collaboratively. He would bring home work with him, and they would work on that together. And sometimes he would also have students and faculty over for dinners in the evening, and they would continue intellectual conversations that way as well. So in that respect, Mary kind of maintained this level of an equal playing ground between her wifely duties and her academic and career goals. I just posted this picture here because there's not many pictures of them together as a family, and Mary's not even in this photo, but on the left is Henry with Mary's siblings, Ambrose and Eugenia, and then the young girl is the Newson's daughter, Carolyn. Now, thanks to this continuation of Mary's involvement while maintaining the duties of a housewife, she finds that she comes to this defining moment in her career. In 1900, there was a Congress of Mathematicians held in Paris, and the well-known mathematician David Hilbert from the same university Mary had gained her Ph.D. from, gave the lecture Mathematical Problems. And his lecture basically outlined the progress made in mathematics during the 19th century, and then challenged current mathematicians at the time to attempt to solve 23 important problems, and these would help guide research for over the next century. So reports of his address were originally published in German. However, the American mathematical community wanted an English translation. So the American Mathematical Society went out and they were looking for a suitable translator that Hilbert would approve of, and asked if Mary would suffice. And he agreed to it, and Mary translated his lecture, and it was published in 1902. And this is all while she was pregnant at the time, and then also raising young children. So this kind of became her defining moment. These translations are hugely important even today in the mathematical community, and it's what made all of this collaborative work possible and made Hilbert's lecture more widely available to the American community as well. Mary did return to academia after her husband's death, which came untimely in 1910. And she's at the point where she's recognizing that widowhood, and especially at that time, widowhood was very financially precarious. And this is again where that piece of advocacy and support comes in. Mary's parents had moved to Lawrence after she had married Henry, so they were in the area and they were able to support in that way. Mary was able to rent out their house in Lawrence, and then her parents kind of looked after her 3 young children while she was trying to kind of get back on her feet and reckon with the fact that, okay, this was the time now to return to the academic community again and get back into working, because at this point after Henry's death, there was no money coming in. So there were a few loose ends to tie up. However, following Henry's death, he had a book that was unpublished that he had been working on. So Mary finishes the draft of that book, and it is published the following year. And then she's looking for work. And because Henry allowed her to continue in these intellectual conversations and continue in this little piece of academia while continuing to manage a household and do everything that a wife does, she was able to maintain her status in the field, and she had options because of all of that networking. And prior to his death, Henry had told her many times that if something were to happen to him, the math department at KU would hire her to take his position. It was common knowledge amongst both families, the Newsons and the Winstons, that out of the 2 of them, between Mary and Henry, Mary was the better mathematician. Everyone agreed on that. And so Henry told her many times, the university will hire you. You can take my position if something does happen. However, there was a nepotism rule in place at that time. And around that same time, Mary's sister Alice was employed in the English department at KU, so they unfortunately could not hire her. So she's looking for work and comes to this realization of, I'm going to have to leave my children, which I think that is a huge thing to have to reckon with, trying to leave your children and then also trying to find work at the same time. She eventually does, though. She's hired at Washburn College in Topeka. And here again, we see that disproportionate level of inequality here. She's the only woman with a doctorate degree and was never promoted during her time there. So again, there's that inequality piece. She doesn't stay here long. There was some issues with the faculty, and they were trying to form a faculty senate because there was a political science professor that kind of accused the college president and the board of trustees of making decisions that required faculty input without that input. So he suggested they form a faculty senate. The president was not very on board with this, and Mary was one of the professors that signed a petition to back this idea of a faculty senate. And this resulted in quite a bit of turmoil at the university. And Mary did not want her children, who eventually came to live with her in Topeka, she didn't want them in that environment. So she moves on and finds a position in Illinois at Eureka College, and this is in 1921. And when she applied for the position, she wrote specifically in her application, basically, look, I have 3 children to raise, and I would like a salary that a man gets. I'm not going to take a lower salary and try to raise 3 young children. So you're going to have to compensate me accordingly. And they agreed. And this is the place that Mary continues the remainder of her teaching career. It's a 35-year teaching career. And it was in Eureka that she became very well known for helping many students who needed financial support throughout the 1930s and the Great Depression. And she just overall was an invaluable resource wherever she went. And so she ends her teaching career here at the time of her retirement in 1942. And I want to close today with this little story that I really enjoy. In 1940, there was this Women's Centennial Congress that was formulated in order to honor 100 women who were at that time working in positions that had not been open to women in 1840, so 100 years prior. And Mary was one of those people named to be honored at this Congress in New York. And she receives the invitation, realizing that the banquet is on the first day of classes at Eureka. She writes, "The trip is out. Any professor knows that he should introduce his own work himself." So she said, "I'm not going." And you'll notice that gendered pronoun there, she specifically puts in the word he, using he to point toward gender inequality, which is still present even in 1940. So again, my original question was equality, did they get there? We don't, who's to say? We're still making progress. And she didn't really tell anyone that she had got this honor. So someone that had gone and she was acquainted with writes to her, and she says, "How gallantly you have borne the banner for women in a new field of a new endeavor, how faithfully you have carried the burdens of a mother through the years, what an inspiration you have been to your students." And of course, she remains very quiet about this. She's a very humble person, and she has this level of humility. But the administration finds out at Eureka, and they host a dinner in honor of that. And this is how she ends her career, with her accomplishments recognized where they may not have been prior. So I'll leave you with this quote, because I do think that Mary was maybe telling the future. Following this dinner in her honor, she's quoted in a local newspaper saying, "I sometimes wonder about women and their educational advantages today, and how 100 years ago women had so little chance for education. And today, do women strive for an education? I suppose those same questions will be coming up in the next 100 years." Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. So we have some time for some questions, and I'll be monitoring the chat too if there's anyone on Zoom that wants to post a question in the chat. Yes.
Thank you very much, Meghan. I was wondering if you could say a little more about this populist moment and her hiring, sort of what exactly is going on there? Is she actually hired because she's seen as more pliable or young and won't cause whatever trouble is going on? Like what exactly is going on?
Yeah, okay. So this is a question about the Populist Party in the 1890s and what that kind of environment is like. And I told Kim the other day, I have a slide just for this purpose. I made a backup slide for this. Because I knew somebody would ask. I will preface by saying I'm not entirely well versed on K-State and the populist movement, but it's a lot to do with, there was an argument about what sort of education should people be having? Where should we be focusing on practical or on the liberal arts? So I think that was the big piece. And I don't know if it had to do with Mary's political leanings. There's not much written about it, but she's one of the incoming faculty that is hired after all of these layoffs. So she was incoming in 1897 during all of this turmoil. I don't know, that probably did not answer your question very well, Dr. Maynard.
So, how close was she in her time studying her doctorate with next study? I think that piece of the studies, they almost overlap.
I want to say Sonia Kovalevsky was 1883. I think she was in the 1880s. And Mary got her PhD in 1897. There was at least 10. Yes. So. I know it. I've read it somewhere. She studied differential equations.
Now we're really quizzing you. What did the introduction say?
Yeah. No.
Yes. Is it Sarah? Or? Yeah, thanks.
So make it especially accurate as far as the art.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm curious how way around that,
My main resource was a book that was self-published by a mathematician. It's called A Woman Ahead of Her Time. And that's where I got a lot of my information from, because the author in there, she quotes letters and interviews with Henry and Mary's daughter. So a lot of it was kind of secondhand, because there's not much for primary sources that I had access to. There is an archive at Smith College in, I believe it's Massachusetts, that I was able to get some photographs, which is where a lot of the photographs on the website and in the presentation come from. And then also they had a transcript of her time in Germany. I believe one of her daughters kind of was probing questions and got Mary to write about her time in Germany. So they did have that on record. And then I also was able to contact the university in Germany and get records from them as well. I've read about what her children did. Her daughters, not so much. Her son studied, he was a physicist, Henry Winston, and ended up at Duke, I believe. Yes. Yes, yeah. I don't know that, but that would be interesting if it did. Like little tidbit, yeah. We have questions on Zoom at all?
I don't see any on Zoom. I did have I didn't know if you could elaborate at all about uh, the initiation of bringing women to Göttingen. Did Felix Klein have a role in this? I mean, I know, so in that photograph, there are 5 students and and 2 of them are women, which
Yes.
even now seems quite high. And so I was wondering if you could comment at all on Felix Klein's involvement or anyone else at Göttingen's involvement in bringing women, specifically in math.
I can't comment on anything very lengthy. I know that, like we've mentioned, like Sonia Kovalevsky was there previously, and then yeah, this from what I've read, Felix Klein was instrumental in this pilot program to bring women to the university, and he was sort of recruiting back in America, that's the extent of my knowledge on it. I didn't go super in depth on that portion, but.
The women that are in the picture, this picture on another one. Were they American, British, or what?
Grace Chisholm, I believe, was British. They were both British, yes. I know Margaret Maltby became a well-known physicist. I don't know where they were working. My project, of course, does not focus on them, but they had pretty lengthy careers, as far as I understand. Somebody else in the department could probably speak more than I can on this, but as I understand, there are some today that are still not solved. Yes, so out of the 23, some of them have been solved, others are in progress, others have not been solved.
Yeah, to elaborate a little on the context of those problems, I guess. Yeah, there are.
I told you somebody would ask.
I know. I told you someone would would ask, which is a great question. So yeah, some of those questions you can actually even look. In Wikipedia, you can even see which questions have been solved explicitly. Some are actually have to be reframed in a way that they can't really be solved. But there are a few that are still outstanding problems that are still some of the biggest research questions that mathematicians kind of focus on. And in general, many of those problems, even if they're not problems that mathematicians are actively saying they're trying to solve, whole areas of mathematics have really grown out of trying to solve those problems. So it was a very important document that she translated.
I should have put that disclaimer out there. I'm not a mathematician.
I guess maybe we can take a moment here and thank Meghan one more time. Okay, well, thank you so much. So as I've been kind of talking to Meghan on and off over the last year, I know Meghan's big focus in this project has been kind of keeping and continuing historical knowledge and continuing kind of our department's knowledge and the university's knowledge of Dr. Winston Newson. And so we talked about ways that we can do this as a department and as a university. And one method that we came up with as the AWM, which is the Association for Women in Math, student chapter here at Kansas State, is to create a lecture series in her name. And in this lecture series, each semester, we're going to bring a graduate student, a minority gender graduate student from a different department, mathematics department, to give a lecture on their research. And so our first lecture in this series is on Monday. And everyone is welcome to attend. I know this is probably not the entire audience is going to be excited about that one, but you're all welcome. So our first speaker is Tejasvi Bhatnagar, and so she'll be speaking next door on Monday to kick off this lecture series. And we're really excited to have her. Wow, my watch is slow. So, so I guess we'll just end by saying, if you wouldn't mind, an extra special thanks to Meghan and Dr. Cohn and the Chapman Center specifically for for their work and their dedication. So thank you so much. And then you're welcome to continue discussions or whatnot over in Cardwell 121 where we have some refreshments. So thank you so much.